Welcome, dear guests, to Stockholm Environment Institute and our annual event, SEI Currents, for 2025. This is the time of year when we look at the trends in the world and which ones will matter the most for sustainability, which ones will shape things moving forward in 2025. This year, we will also take a quick look at what has happened with the trends we foresaw last year. So that will be very interesting. But first, a couple of words about where SEI is today. Next slide, please. So this map gives a short overview of SEI's locations and our history. So today, SEI is an institute with 7 research centers around the world. Over the years, over the last couple of decades, we have established new centers in the so-called Global South, the lower income regions in Southeast Asia, East Africa, and Latin America. Today, we are about 400 people this year, and we are working across critical environmental and sustainability dimensions. For example, air pollution, climate change mitigation and adaptation, the energy transition, the net zero industry transition, vulnerability, and many other themes. So I will say a couple of words about our new strategy. Next slide. We have just concluded a strategy cycle, and we have started a new one. The board approved our 2025 to 2029 strategy in September, and we are now launching into this. And I can say that this new strategy builds a lot on our past and our strengths and legacy, but it's also about adapting our research agenda and our methods and our focus to the new turbulent times that we find ourselves in. Last year's currents analysis became actually very important input to the strategy that we have in front of us now. So, for example, the fragmentation of the multilateral collaboration landscape and the international politics, which are becoming much more difficult, the increasing urgency of the climate, environment, pollution crisis, the rising issue of social gaps and social inequities around the world. At the same time, very rapid technological change, both digital and AI movements, but also how renewable energy, renewable storage, and industry applications that are more climate friendly are becoming market mature very quickly. But also this leading to problems of land competition and sometimes land conflict due to the new requirements supplying the materials, the raw materials for the climate, the green transition. So we identified a couple of new directions. Next slide, please. Building on this analysis. The first is the increasing urgency. So SEI is committed to strengthening our research on and support for implementation. It's meaning that we will provide knowledge that is strengthening action on the ground, and while of course also continuing to support policymaking, agenda setting, etc. Secondly, we will invest more in innovative research in emerging topics drawn from our analysis, including topics like minerals and mining, the relationship between AI and sustainability, the relationship between security, defense, and sustainability, and a number of other topics that are coming into focus for us over the coming years. We will also engage more in research to policy networks for more lasting impact, trying to build for the long term our partnerships with partners in both policy practice as well as in research. So avoid jumping from project to project and instead have network orientation to our engagement. Fourthly, to strengthen the use of data and data analysis tools. This is becoming ever more important in the landscape of AI, and to be able to use evidence and data in systematic and aggregated ways. And finally, a somewhat more internal dimension, to work more as one SEI globally, so we can draw upon all our centers together when we approach a subject or a policy challenge. And this is something we call One SEI. This is just a small nugget of information about our new strategy. You can read about it on our website, both a short version as well as the longer full version, if you're interested to learn more. With that, I will hand over to our Research Director and Deputy Director, Åsa Persson, who will talk us through the current approach and what happened with our predictions 1 year ago. Over to you, Åsa.
Thank you very much, Måns. Warm welcome from me too, and a happy new year to everyone. So first, briefly on what is Currents, why do we do it, and how do we do it? And then this retrospective of our Currents from last year. So this is our, as Måns said, our annual Foresight event. It's the 4th edition, and we chose to call it Currents rather than Trends for a few different reasons. We think it's a very good metaphor for, you know, this more dynamic idea of these trends. First of all, a current can be, you know, it can be visible, surface water, easily seen, or it's an undercurrent shaping other events. Currents mesh together in quite intricate ways, in unanticipated ways. And of course, also we believe that sustainability initiatives, policies, practices sometimes can surf a current, swim with the current, but sometimes are swimming against the current. So this is why we chose the currents metaphor. Why we do it, it's partly to inform our internal research agenda, our strategy, but we also want to share our view of the world with our stakeholders and partners to help make sense and shape the conversation. And we think, of course, many organizations today do these kind of foresight activities. We think we can provide a unique perspective here, given first our globally distributed network of experts. So that's really our starting point, what is happening in different parts of the world. So try and avoid a certain geographical bias in what we see around us. Secondly, drawing on our leading experts who have really both the scientific expertise, but also are typically very street smart people, I would say. So we draw on their knowledge. And how we do it, we interview staff, we do an institute-wide survey to try and get to a short list, and we do focus groups, as well as drawing on expertise from our Science Advisory Council. So that led us to the 3 currents that you will shortly hear about from my colleagues for 2025. But as I said, first, a brief retrospective, looking back to the 3 currents we identified last year. This is both to try and take stock together with you. We had an eventful, turbulent year last year, but it's also for us to kind of test our foresight abilities. So the first one was, we called it missing the mark, facing up to the prospect of exceeding 1.5 degree warming. 1 year later, unfortunately, this is exactly what we are doing. So 1 year ago, we were concerned, like many climate scientists and experts, that in 2024, we would exceed 1.5 degrees warming for the first time. And we were right in that prediction. So we asked, what might that entail? Will it spark a doom loop of inaction and overwhelm, or will it sound that, very strong wake-up call to the world to speed up, to transform, and to limit the overshoot of 1.5? We suggested a couple of signposts to look out for last year. One was the election outcomes from the many super elections that took place last year. And I think by now we know that climate did feature in some election campaigns, debates. And it seems that we will continue to retain climate ambition, whether sufficient or not, in places like the EU, the UK, Mexico. But as we also learned yesterday, the US under President Trump is now leaving the Paris Agreement. We also suggested to look out for Paris Agreement ambition, and we were already a year ago anticipating the new cycle of NDCs, nationally determined contributions, which are due February this year, so in a month's time. By now, we have learned that it will likely be a slower process than we thought, with late submissions from, for example, China and EU. But the good news here is that some countries have already submitted, like Brazil, UK, Japan. So what to make of this? We will have to see how the NDCs collectively add up to meet the level needed. The IPCC has called for a 57% emission cut by 2035 compared with 2019. We will also have to see what role China will play as the biggest emitter and also now the biggest economy under the Paris Agreement. What to make of this? So at SEI, we stand ready to support countries developing ambitious NDCs that really capture co-benefits for human health, for labor productivity, for nature. But more than that, we want to provide knowledge for effective implementation of NDCs in terms of financing investment into projects identified in the NDCs and helping to develop sector roadmaps for decarbonization of heavy industry or building a bioeconomy roadmap, for example. So we're very proud that our tools have already been used for more than 60 NDCs worldwide so far. The second trend that we identified last year was the new space race. So we predicted this intensifying competition to control land, oceans, and outer space, and the really high-value resources that sit in these domains: minerals, forests, biodiversity. So we asked, will there be greater conflict or stronger pressures for cooperation? And this really came from our work in different parts of the world: Africa, Southeast Asia, also here in Sweden, northern Sweden, observing growing conflict over land use, often involving vulnerable communities. And this sort of competition, not just driven by economic value and profitability, but also to some extent policy pressures, for example, to source critical minerals for the renewable energy transition and to secure land for carbon dioxide removal. We saw similar competition also when it comes to oceans and outer space. On this one, we were less predictive, but we noted several opportunities to discuss cooperation opportunities on global policy agendas, like the United Nations Environment Assembly and the Summit on the Future. But now that we take stock, we see that these different processes did not really resolve whether cooperative approaches will materialize. And we notice continuing competitive pressure and risk of even more conflicts. So at SEI, we try to ensure that these complex situations, often very context-specific, are evidence-based, and we want to equip all actors with knowledge. So we're now launching, for example, a mining and minerals program, and also look how we can mobilize expertise around agriculture and land more effectively across the Institute. So we plan to develop data platforms to track resource flows, but also continue to do a lot of stakeholder facilitation to support cooperative outcomes. The third and final current we identified last year was called transitioning to a new global order. And this is, of course, a mega trend affecting so many actors and organizations today, changing geopolitics. Will it lead to either more fragmentation, a weakening of multilateral institutions, or reinvention? Over the past years, we have witnessed so many trends, nationalist tendencies in many parts of the world, rising autocracy, changing alliances, BRICS, NATO, expanding, rising concerns over competitiveness and changing geoeconomics. The latter both caused by and with consequences for the energy and climate transition. And on top of this, an escalating frustration from low-income parts of the world around increasing debt burden and inequalities in the global financial architecture. But at the same time, and a bit contradictory, we also see that many multilateral institutions keep deepening or expanding their work. And if you look at indicators on multilateralism, we actually see that more and more countries participate in international treaties. So as we take stock, we think our prediction was right, that the world is indeed in a process of transition, but it's yet too early to say what it will land in. And I think we saw that in some of the big environmental negotiations last year, where progress was made, but also some of them, like biodiversity, desertification, plastics pollutions, ended early, but quite abruptly, with more work to be done. So how do we at SEI respond to this? I think we try to take a balanced approach, keeping calm, carrying on. It would be naive, of course, not to try and understand these changing geopolitics. But these are also the things that reach the media headlines. So in the on-the-ground work that we do, we also see determination to make progress on sustainability. We see a demand for technical knowledge and assistance. And we also see a lot of cities, companies, NGOs who are keen to learn from others and want to collaborate nationally and internationally. So at SEI, we are now wrapping up a major research program on geopolitics and sustainability, and we'll try and mainstream this perspective more in our work. And we will also focus and double down on migration, on AI and sustainability, and again, providing more data on supply chains and how they can become more sustainable and resilient. So those were some of the, or those were the currents from last year and how we are trying to shape them through our work. And with that, I'd like to hand over now to Rob Watt to introduce the currents for this year. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Åsa. And a warm welcome to you all to this Currents 2025. We're almost ready to unveil our currents for this year, but we don't want only to hear from SEI's experts, we also want to hear from you. We've created a Mentimeter question here, and we'd really love for you to log on to Menti and provide your answer to what you think will be the most impactful trend on sustainability in 2025. We won't show you the result of this straight away, so you've got plenty of time to get yourself ready to put in some answers to this question, and we'll reveal the collective intelligence on this question to everybody after we've heard the currents presented by my colleagues. I'd also like really to welcome our listeners and viewers on LinkedIn Live. Please also get involved, get stuck into this question too. And now it's a great pleasure to introduce the first current and the speaker who will present the first current. I've been working together with two colleagues at SEI, Brandon and Lynsi Burton, who've been really trying to piece together all of this brilliant insight that we've obtained across SEI to put together our three currents. And the honour to lies with Karen, to introduce the first of these three currents. Karen, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Welcome, everyone, to Currents for 2025. For 4 years running now, it's been my privilege to take part in the thought-provoking conversations that are integral to the Currents foresight process here at SEI. And today, it's my privilege to introduce the first of the issues that surfaced from those conversations as key trends that SEI will be watching closely and working to address as 2025 continues to unfold. I join today from SEI's Center in Oxford, England. From here, however, I whisk you away across time and time zones. Come along with me to my grandparents' home in a small town on the prairie in the United States not so long ago. On Grandpa Brandon's oak desk sits a weighty black box tethered to the wall with a thick rope. It has a dial on the front and something that could be mistaken for a small barbell on top. This contraption, it's a telephone. The barbell, its knobs are the ear and mouthpieces. The phone rings in different patterns of short and long, depending on which household on the party line is the intended recipient. And all this is supervised by an operator. We knew her by name, and she knew pretty much all the goings on in town from the conversations that she overheard. Now, you might fairly ask what on earth this has to do with the intertwined climate, environment, and sustainable development crises facing the world. And to that, I answer simply, everything. Because our first trend to watch is what futurist Alan Toffler called that great growling engine of change, technology. Could we have the next slide, please? Technology, and specifically its myriad, fast-moving, and fantastical frontiers. This is the contemporary iteration of Grandpa Brandon's party line. In the just 18 years since it came into the market, the smartphone has found its way into the hands of some 7.5 billion people worldwide. It's not hyperbole to say that it's transformed the world. To be clear, I'm holding up the phone merely as an emblem for the technological vanguard, which is upending our thinking about what achievements are viable and what threats are credible. As the scientist and futurist Arthur C. Clarke evocatively put it in his inquiry into the limits of the possible, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Could we have the new slide, please? We live in a world with almost unbelievable know-how. We've learned how to edit human genes, devise a worldwide web of information, create artificial intelligence. Yet it's also a world that, in the century and a half since the invention of the light bulb, has yet to find the wherewithal to bring more than 1 billion people out of utter dark. Now the world is seeking to tap human ingenuity again, and this time to address the unintended consequences from the wonder technology of another age, the one that discovered how to transform the world by harnessing the power from the burning of fossil fuels. And so our current poses the question, can the world, so to speak, technovate its way out of the intertwined climate, environment, and sustainable development crises? Moving now from the emblematic to the pragmatic, the International Energy Agency says that almost half of the new carbon emission reductions needed to achieve net zero in 2050 depend on technologies currently in prototype or development. Some advances give the world reason for optimism. New battery and solar power and wind energy innovations are making it possible to generate more power at lower costs and far faster than most people had anticipated. By contrast, the prospect of some technologies gives us pause, and geoengineering comes to mind. Since the invention of the very basics, all the way back to man's stone implements and that first wheel, technology's given us new ways to do things we've never done before. The technologies now at our disposal and on the horizon are tools that countries and companies and individuals will seek to use for myriad aims, to wield geopolitical influence, to solve the world's problems, to gain economic advantage, uncover new scientific insights, establish their military might, better understand our universe, devise new ways of working and living, control the narrative, make the world a better place, make a profit, gratify an ego. This frontier is different from the one that gave rise to the World Wide Web. Now, new technologies are largely concentrated in private hands. Agendas are largely set by a handful of big tech firms. And it's fair to ask whether the focus will be on the public good or the corporate bottom line, or if the two can benefit one another. How will these technological trends play out in 2025 and beyond? Well, it won't be enough to move fast and break things anymore. Engineering answers to these crises requires more than ingenuity. It takes a vision of what could be, a technology that makes the vision feasible, an approach that makes the technology economically viable, and an environment, an elixir of economic incentives and political will that makes it possible to scale things up and at speed. Which technologies will find the mix to take off this year and in the coming years? Which will be elusive, just some other cold fusion? Well, we're asking, for instance, this year, will green hydrogen, the linchpin for hard-to-abate manufacturing emissions, overcome growing concerns about its costs and practicality? Will carbon capture, storage, and removal technologies prove themselves? Will long-term energy storage solve the conundrum of the intermittency of renewable power? And then there are the questions posed by the advent of what is likely to be the defining technology of our times, artificial intelligence. Could I have the next slide, please? AI, the subject of an SEI Current highlighted 2 years ago, is here. In fact, are you listening to a presentation by Karen Brandon, the human, or one generated by her AI twin? Smarter than humans technology could deliver a century of scientific progress in 10 years, so says Jack Clark, who founded the AI safety and research company Anthropic and was once the policy director of OpenAI. An interesting trio of perspectives emerged from the Nobel Prizes awarded last year, from the perspective of inventor, user, and analyst. Geoffrey Hinton, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics for his work creating AI, greeted the announcement by saying, "I'm worried that the overall consequences of this might be systems more intelligent than us that eventually take control." Demis Hassabis, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for work that involved using AI to crack the code for protein structures, said, "The best scientists paired with these kinds of tools will be able to do incredible things." And Daron Acemoglu, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics for work examining the role of technology and institutions in economic development, expressed concerns about AI. Not about smart AI, but instead about what he called dumb AI. And by that, he meant AI using the wrong ways, both losing out on its potential and making it into a major contributor to more inequality and the greater weakening of democracy through data collection and manipulation. Clearly, the world will have to wield this new tool very, very carefully. Governments, which seem to move at a slower pace than technology, must nevertheless find ways to regulate AI to tap its innovative potential and at the same time avoid enormous social, economic, and political costs. And it also must find ways to stem AI's power literally so that it does not suck up outlandish amounts of energy and water. The opportunities and risks are many. Will advances make it possible for poorer countries to leapfrog over old, polluting technologies? Or will wealthier countries push ahead, leaving poorer people and places even further behind? Will new technologies be used to foster greater well-being and bridge development gaps? Or will they amplify old problems in new ways, advancing weapons of war, cyber warfare, disinformation, and censorship? Could I have a new slide, please? These trends will play out over years and decades, but in 2025, here are 3 signposts that can help us detect which way the currents are flowing. The first is the geopolitics of technology. How will the battle between the US and China for technological supremacy play out on its many stages? And there are so many: electric vehicles, computer chips, renewable energy manufacturing, well, TikTok. And how will global trade and threatened tariffs come into play? A second signpost is AI governance. Can the world set meaningful guardrails for AI's use? What will emerge from the Artificial Intelligence Action Summit in Paris next month? Will the summit deliver on its aims to ensure that AI drives beneficial social, economic, and environmental outcomes? Will governments force private technology companies to spend more of their resources on safety research, as Jeffrey Hinton has suggested? And the third signpost is the so-called gold rush for critical minerals. How will the race proceed to secure the key energy transition materials needed for a green transition? Mining of resources from the world's deep seabeds is a global focal point here. What will emerge from key International Seabed Authority negotiations in July and from the Global Council for Responsible Transition Minerals in November? Can the mining of the minerals needed for the green transition find a way to overcome the poor environmental legacy of mining and to address the growing protests in regions that fear the consequences of mining in their backyard? As I close, come with me again, traveling on one last journey back in time, this time to Manchester, just up the road from us here in Oxford, nearly 80 years ago. There, Alan Turing is working on a computing device, something he calls a mechanical mind, that shows it can perform a calculation so long and so intricate that it once had been considered impossible to do. Turing, who would come to be widely known as the father of computer science, gave an interview at that time about his work. Decades later, his ideas underpin the devices that run our world, and his words remain in circulation too. They are printed on the Bank of England's 50-pound notes, which themselves are printed not on paper, but on synthetic polymer, something that may become obsolete in some future cashless society. His words have a timeless quality that will surely outlast the notes. And as he said then, and as we understand now in 2025, this is only a foretaste of what is to come and only the shadow of what is going to be. And now I hand back over to my colleague, Robert Watt, to introduce our second current.
Thank you very much, Karen. As the world confronts a changing climate, new tensions are arising over land as a proxy for power and a resource to reach climate, environment, and sustainable development goals. I'm sitting in Stockholm, some 1,000 kilometers south of Kebnekaise, Sweden's highest mountain. On the 15th of September last year, a team of researchers from Stockholm University carried out the annual measurement of the south peak of Kebnekaise. The height was measured at 2,089.9 meters above sea level, a decrease of 3.3 meters since the last measurement in September 2023. Again, the North Peak, a snowless, rocky tip, is Sweden's highest point, having overtaken the South Peak for the first time since records began in 2019. Now, it's 7 meters higher. The ground beneath our feet increasingly reveals the strains of unprecedented demand and change. The shrinking of Kebnekaise is just one example of what is happening to the Arctic ecosystem. An ecosystem spanning Siberia, Alaska, the Nordic countries, and Canada that has been accumulating carbon for thousands of years, helping manage the Earth's temperature. But in a warming world, the carbon cycle in the region is beginning to change. Just today, in Nature Climate Change, scientists have published new data showing that more than 30% of the Arctic was a net source of carbon dioxide, a figure that rises to 40% when emissions from wildfires were included. What at the other extreme, where it's hot and dry? This is the task of the UNCCD, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the poor cousin, if you like, of the three Rio Conventions, the others being the UNFCCC, the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change, with its huge annual hooplas, and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which hosts the Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and targets such as 30 by 30, that is, conserving 30% of land and sea through designation as protected areas by 2030. But back to the UNCCD and back to December 2024. On the eve of the 16th Conference of the Parties, the UNCCD released a report with some truly remarkable statistics. Some 77.6% of the Earth's land experienced drier conditions during the 3 decades leading up to 2020 compared to the previous 30-year period. And over the same period, dry lands expanded by about 4.3 million square kilometers, an area nearly a third larger than India. And they now cover 40% of all land on Earth. As the Secretary General of the UNCCD explained, droughts end. Aridity represents a permanent, unrelenting transformation. This change is redefining life on Earth. The UNCCD is not the only multinational forum taking an interest in land and land use. In late 2024 in Cali, Colombia, the UN Biodiversity Conference managed to establish a new benefit-sharing mechanism for genetic resources and to recognize indigenous peoples as key stewards in conservation efforts. Yet most nations failed to submit or update promised biodiversity strategies and action plans, and donor countries did not meet financial pledges that underpin a global biodiversity fund. These negotiations will resume next month in Rome at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, something to keep an eye on this year. It's more than 5 years since a special report on climate change and land by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change outlined the urgency to act on climate, on overexploitation of resources, and on coordinated action. Projected risks to ecosystems and human systems under varying global temperature increases highlight key areas such as water scarcity, soil erosion, and food supply instabilities. In this diagram, risks are categorized by the severity and confidence levels, emphasizing the urgent need for effective land management and climate action. Take the arid and semi-arid regions of Kenya, for example. Here's a picture of the region of Turkana in Kenya. Rising severity and frequency of droughts and floods, unprecedented emergence of pests and diseases, increased land degradation and variations in temperature and rainfall are having huge impacts on communities and value chains. SEI's own work on 8 value chains, things like mangrove, poultry, honey, and their importance to livelihoods in 4 arid and semi-arid counties of Kenya, Narok, Elgeyo Marakwet, West Pokot, and Turkana, concludes that anticipated increases in temperature and decreases in rainfall will exacerbate water and heat stress, adversely impacting crop growth, animal productivity, and yields overall. For these communities, land is livelihoods, and that land is withering in front of them. On the other side of the world, attitudes to land are different. Just yesterday, the 47th President of the United States of America issued a slew of executive orders, one of which is all about unleashing American energy. You could also just simply call it drill, baby, drill, as he undoes protections for federal lands and encourages their exploitation for oil and for minerals. So it's really time for a dose of realism about the human footprint. As the most recent Land Gap report points out, Many land-based carbon removal efforts outlined in nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement require more than 1 billion hectares, more than the areas of South Africa, India, Turkey, and the European Union combined. In 5 African countries, 25 million hectares of land have been granted to the company Blue Carbon for carbon offsets spanning about 30 years. This sort of allocation makes up about 20% of the total land area of Zimbabwe and 10% of the total land area of Liberia, including forest. Whose emissions will be offset by these carbon credits? Oil and gas companies? And these are not the only green projects that are competing for land resources. 1 million hectares is earmarked in Morocco for green hydrogen production. The updated nationally determined contributions will reveal how countries are tackling the challenge of carbon removals and whether the international community is taking a collective risk and community-informed approach to climate change and land. Will COP30, taking place in Brazil at the end of 2025, be a boost for natural climate solutions, that catch-all phrase that covers a broad sweep of efforts to conserve, restore, and manage forests, grasslands, and wetlands? Will it enable these projects to attract finance and ensure their longevity and integrity? In 2025, might we see biodiversity offsetting, water credits, and the like begin moving from concept to product, with attendant risks to food security? After all, food systems account for 80% of deforestation, 29% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and almost all biodiversity loss. At the same time, it seems that the amount of agricultural land has peaked, even that there is a decoupling between food production and land use. Are we finally making progress to reduce humanity's land footprint? It has long been a recommendation of scientists that countries and the international community must govern global land resources systematically and cooperatively, and change how land is valued and its stewardship financed. One hopeful example that the World Bank's Land Conference, which takes place in May, should look to is in Chinaruco in Colombia. Chinaruco is a protected area. It's unique for 2 reasons. The first, because it has 2 different climatic conditions during the year. It's dry for 6 months, it's flooded for 6 months. The second unique aspect is that its local communities live somewhat symbiotically with the rich biodiversity in its landscapes, including savannas that host livestock. But climate change means that the dry and flooding seasons will be more intensive. This picture actually demonstrates that the human intervention of a basic road is acting as a fire break and is protecting some of those natural ecosystems. In addition, the bioeconomy is one of the most promising approaches for tackling the intersecting crises of biodiversity, climate, and land degradation. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development has predicted that the global bioeconomy will be a 7.7 trillion market by 2030. It really holds huge potential for lower and middle-income countries through new value chains, innovative products, and employment opportunities that promote a new post-carbon economic model. The notion of transforming cassava into bioplastics might sound like science fiction, but it's no more than the combination of human ingenuity and cassava's starchy contents. As research carried out by SEI shows, with cassava grown in all 32 departments of Colombia, the country is standing on the threshold of a bioeconomy revolution in which bioplastic production from industrial cassava starch is being undertaken by a company previously focused on petroleum-derived plastics. This year, we expect the G20 to take forward a set of principles on the socio-bioeconomy that were adopted at the G20 in November last year. The South African presidency of the G20 has the opportunity to shift it from a concept to viable business models. In conclusion, land is so much more than a location for extraction. It's a source of cultural identity, a place of spiritual significance, and a wellspring of human inspiration. Throughout time, contests have been waged over land, over how to use it, who controls it, and who profits. As one of the first ecologists, Aldo Leopold, said, the oldest task in human history, to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And now let me pass over to my colleague, Lynsi Burton, who will take us into the third current.
Thank you so much, Rob. Good morning from Seattle, Washington. I'm Lynsi Burton, the U.S. Center Communications Officer at SEI. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Next slide, please. I live about as far away as one can from Washington, D.C. in the lower 48 states, but yesterday's inauguration of President Donald Trump nonetheless touches us all. And in this current, on our quickly evolving geopolitical landscape, hits close to home, as I'm sure it does for all of you. Next slide, please. In 2024, more than 70 countries representing about half the global population underwent national elections. Of course, we can debate which of these elections were truly democratic, but that's the figure. Naturally, this brings a new set of world leaders and ascendant political parties to the fore, giving the world order a different look and feel. Another 30 or so countries are expected to undergo elections in 2025, including for heads of state of major global powers like Germany and Canada, as well as countries whose leadership can have a bearing on the war in Ukraine, like Belarus and Poland. All this in a year when the latest nationally determined contributions are due to the UNFCCC. In other words, countries' updated climate goals for 2035 under the Paris Agreement. While they are due quite soon, they are widely expected to mostly come through toward the end of the year, closer to the COP30 summit in Brazil. Next slide, please. Specifically, what we see now among democracies is a crisis of confidence. South Korea's president is impeached and arrested. Germany's newly dissolved parliament has prompted a February snap election, and Canada's leadership is now up in the air in the wake of Justin Trudeau's resignation. Political incumbency is losing its power, even in countries where reigning leaders have, on paper, come out on top. This phenomenon reflects the public's eroding trust in the leaders expected to both spearhead domestic green transitions and form multilateral climate agreements. In the US, India, South Africa, France, and the UK, reigning parties lost, underperformed, or ceded ground to fringe ideologues gaining footholds in representative bodies. Perhaps the most earth-shattering election was in the US, which voted to restore Donald Trump to the White House. And just as he was sworn in yesterday, he ordered the US to back out of the Paris Agreement once again. He has threatened to annex both geographic neighbors and allies, Mexico and Canada, and is talking a big game on seizing Greenland and Panama. Furthermore, according to the blueprint for his presidency, known as Project 2025, U.S. membership in NATO, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the UNFCCC are all in question. Needless to say, such growing hyper-nationalism across the globe bodes poorly for multilateral collaboration on climate and sustainable development. Now is a time when global cooperation and investment are required to boost the ambition of 2025 nationally determined contributions so that global plans can help limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius, down from the current track of 2.5 to 2.9 degrees. Next image, please. Zooming in on green technology and trade, China reigns supreme. The country's massive investment in electric vehicles and batteries gave the country a 70% share of global EV production in 2023. By that time, China also surpassed Japan as the world's largest overall vehicle exporter. This dominance can pose economic crises to major car-making countries like Japan, the US, and Germany, and may only serve to propel more trade barriers. Combined with Trump's threats to impose massive tariffs on some of America's closest trade partners, this dynamic may increase the price of the green transition and push it further out of reach instead of advancing it. That's to say nothing of the reverberating economic upheaval these trade wars could touch off across all sectors and facets of life. Next slide, please. More grimly, we have an arms race in progress, driven by tensions between China and its neighbors, rapid pursuit of AI technologies, new advances in drone weaponry, and exploding conflict in the Middle East, North Africa, and Ukraine. This led to record-high military spending across the world, and the first time since 2009 that defense spending went up in each of the 5 major world regions shown here. Just last week, the World Economic Forum released its 2025 Global Risks Report, which reveals the results of its annual survey of more than 900 government, business, and civil society leaders from all over the globe. It asks respondents to rate 33 specific risks on 3 different timelines: this year, in the next 2 years, and in the next 10 years. Last week's results indicate that the #1 risk for 2025 is state-based armed conflict, which is up from #8 last year and was not considered a major risk at all only 2 years ago. For the 2-year timeline, state-based armed conflict jumped from #5 to #3. Relatedly, geoeconomic confrontation climbed 5 positions to #9 for the 2-year time horizon. The statistics bring this threat into stark relief. There were nearly 60 armed conflicts in 2023, the highest number ever recorded, and about 2 billion people, or 1/4 of the world's population, live in conflict-affected countries. Civilian fatalities jumped 30% from 2023 to 2024. The growing vacuum in multilateral diplomacy and leadership, something we addressed at last year's Currents, will only push states to increasingly take national security into their own hands. Next slide, please. This brings us to migration, which is related. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, conflict and climate crises forcibly displaced over 122 million people in the last 10 years, more than half of those within their own countries. About half of those people also reside in countries affected by both conflict and severe climate hazards, such as Syria, Haiti, Sudan, and Myanmar. The Syrian coup last month will offer one of the most prominent demonstrations for modern migration issues in the year to come, as thousands of refugees plot a return home from within and outside the country's borders. The UN estimates that more than 115,000 people already returned to Syria from other countries in less than 4 weeks after the fall of the Assad regime. Many more continue to weigh their options in the face of economic and political uncertainty in their home country. Additional Middle East turmoil in the coming year could further drive displacement. Next slide, please. These are all complex factors countries must balance when they come to the table for financial and climate summits, such as COP30, G20, and the Financing for Development Forum. The International Court of Justice is also expected to issue a ruling on countries' legal liability for climate change, which can set precedent for future climate litigation. Ultimately, the question is whether cooperation can prevail over crisis. Thank you for listening today, and many thanks to the entire SEI team for informing these insights and bringing us all together. And I apologize again for the technical issues. With that, I hand you back to Rob.
Thank you very much, Lynsi. We've now presented our 3 currents for 2025. We've given you some signposts to look out for during the course of this year, where we think that these issues will break the surface and they will have to be confronted by the international community, by policymakers, by practitioners. But we also know that, hearing from the 3 of us and trying to capture and put together all the pieces of intelligence and insights that we've received from our colleagues is not enough. And we have decided this year to create a set of podcasts for you. And the podcast series is called Currents in Sustainability. It's available at all the usual places where you might find and download your podcasts. do take a look at these. And if we go to the next slide, I can just give you a sneak preview as to who is involved in the podcasts. So the first podcast, which is going to go live at 4 o'clock today, I think, is Grounds for Change. It's all about the current that I was talking about. And we have a couple of SEI experts, Monica Trujillo and Salome Kugbega, joined by a very, very experienced worker in the field of land use and deforestation and biodiversity, Irene Suarez Perez. And that, as I said, is going to be out and live for you in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. But the next episode will, in Currents in Sustainability, will be Reaching New Frontiers in Technology. And we have 3 fantastic speakers on this. Again, a couple of SEI experts, Somya Joshi and Miquel Munoz Cabré, and joined by Kelly Levine. And Kelly's an amazing speaker who is really the brains behind the System Change Lab, and she's currently working at the Bezos Earth Fund. Next slide, please. And our last podcast, which is all about the trend that you heard, the current that you heard from Lynsi. We haven't recorded this yet because we knew that there were going to be momentous things happening even at the beginning of this week. So this is being recorded tomorrow and will be released in due course. And that's all about the geopolitics and the mandates for action on climate and other sustainability issues. Next slide, please. So we are very grateful to all of you for listening in to our fantastic, currents for this year. We, I think, are going to hopefully show brilliant, the Menti that we asked you to complete, to give us a sense of what you think are going to be the issues that are going to influence the sustainability agenda in 2025. And although it's a bit small on the screen, I hope you can see here that, you know, we've got a lot of different words where polarization is definitely taking the center stage here, but is closely ringed by issues around technology, which we've already heard about, AI. I can see geopolitics also there, authoritarianism, but hopefully some more sort of hopeful things here. We've got the circular economy coming in here as well. But yes, extreme climate events, the US leaving the Paris Agreement, for example. So there's a huge, I mean, what this tells us is there is there are huge headwinds that we're facing in our currents, but also that this whole agenda around sustainability is so broad and it interacts so comprehensively and is entwined in so many other things, whether it's finance, politics, technology. So it's great to see this. Thank you very much for sharing. I think we're going to round off. We've reached time, and we're going to say thank you again to all of you for listening in to our Currents 2025. Thank you.